Welcome, everyone. It's great to have you join us this afternoon. My name is Bruce Lennox. I'm the Dean of the Faculty of Science. On behalf of the faculty, I'd like to welcome you all to the 7th edition of Sun and Science. This is an offshoot of our famed Soup and Science that we have each September and each January for a week. Because we can't deliver the soup to your home, we have been cheekily providing sun for you today and many of the other days that we've had. We have a great lineup today. We have 3 professors: Professor Mylene Riva from the Department of Psychology, Professor Blake Richard from the School of Computer Science, and Professor Mylene Riva from the Department of Geography. What they're giving you today is a snapshot of research that takes place in their research labs, in their research programs, because every professor, of course, is both an instructor, a teacher, but also a researcher. And every researcher, as a professor, works with teams. And the teams are graduate students, postdoctoral fellows, and undergraduates, like many of you are. And this is really important because the Faculty of Sciences is dedicated to provide a real research experience for every undergraduate. During your experience here, your 3 or 4 years, very often it's many research experiences. So quite often when you hear these Sun and Science talks, you're going to be hear reference made to undergraduates who were in the past key parts of the research programs that our presenters are describing. So the very simple rules here. We're going to begin with Melanie's presentation, but they'll follow by Blake and Mylene. But once the presentations are completed, you'll each receive a message from the host of the Zoom host to join a breakout room. So in this breakout room, you'll be in smaller groups, and you'll have the opportunity to ask questions of each presenter through the chat. And each presenter will then rotate through the room, so every 10 minutes, so you'll have a chance to speak and to chat with each one of the presenters, and then we'll come back to the main room.
Hello, everyone. I assume you can all hear me. My name is Blake Richards. I am assistant professor at the School of Computer Science, and also actually at the Department of Neurology and Neurosurgery. And today I'm just going to give you, I'll say a kind of broader overview of the research program that my lab is engaged in, and some of the kind of philosophy behind that research program. The way I describe it sometimes in informal circumstances is that we use artificial brains to understand real ones. So what does this actually mean? Well, there's this tool that we have nowadays called artificial neural networks. Artificial neural networks are really just a form of model. They are a form of mathematical model that attempt to simulate what the brain does at the algorithmic level. Now, let me unpack that for you a little bit. So, our brains are computers, period. Many people imagine that when we say this, we're trying to make an analogy or that we're using a metaphor or something like that. I'm not using a metaphor. Your brain is literally a computer. Now, the definition of what a computer is something that not everyone fully understands. So let me just clarify, your brain is not at all like your laptop or your phone. The way that your brain computes things is very different from the way that your laptop or your phone computes things. And in particular, there are 2 key features to the way that your brain computes and the algorithms that your brain uses. To clarify, an algorithm is basically just a recipe for doing a computation. So it's a series of things that must be done in order to arrive at some answer or some behavior. The algorithms that your brain uses are very different from the sorts of algorithms that we use on our laptops. And the 2 key differences are our brains operate in parallel. So you have 80 billion neurons in your brain, which each of which is a tiny little microprocessor effectively. And whereas in a standard computer, there is 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 kind of CPUs, central processing units, that process the steps required for the algorithm one at a time in a sequential manner. All of the neurons in your brain are operating at once. So it's a massively parallel computational system. And also the way in which information gets represented in your brain is that it is distributed across millions of neurons throughout the brain in wide distributed networks. And so artificial neural networks attempt to mimic this. They are a mathematical model that utilizes many different simple elements that try to capture some of the basic properties of neurons. They're often just illustrated as balls with connections between them, because what they try to capture is the way in which real neurons integrate information from multiple sources. And they all operate in parallel, and they represent things in a distributed manner. And what's interesting is that artificial neural networks were developed originally as models of the brain and of the mind, but they have become the workhorse of modern artificial intelligence. And the reason is that the goal of artificial intelligence, arguably, is to get computers to do the sorts of things that people can do. And it turns out that if you copy the brain at the algorithmic level, you are better at getting the computer to actually do the sorts of things that people do. Now, in addition to using artificial neural networks for the sake of better AI and using inspiration from the brain to develop better AI, we're also then interested in the lab in turning that back around. So we're interested in both trying to understand artificial neural networks and use that understanding to understand the brain. And in particular, there are 3 tools that we use to understand artificial neural networks. These are objective functions, architectures, and learning rules. Architectures are fairly easy to understand. They're the way in which all those little nodes or units or neurons are connected to one another. And just as with artificial neural networks, we can understand a lot about the brain by tracing out the architecture of the brain and understanding how different types of neurons are connected to one another. The other way in which we understand artificial neural networks is by their learning rules. That is, the rules by which they update themselves to make themselves better at some task. And indeed, our brains are highly plastic, and our ability to learn is key to our intelligence. So understanding the learning rules in the brain is part of understanding our intelligence. And then lastly, the question that you always have to ask whenever you have a learning rule is, what is the objective of the learning? We measure this in artificial neural networks with a quantification we call objective functions, or sometimes loss functions. And basically, these are big, high-dimensional functions that tell us whether the system is doing good at some task or doing poorly at some task. And that task can be many different things. It could be how well it's engaged in some motor system, motor planning, how well it can ride a bike, how well it can translate something, how well it can categorize different images based upon their contents, etc. And so part of what we're trying to do in the lab is to map out the objective functions of the brain, to understand exactly what sorts of tasks your brain is actually trying to get better at. So to wrap things up, ultimately, the way that we view our research is that there's a sort of virtuous cycle that we can enter into between neuroscience and machine learning or artificial intelligence, wherein neuroscience can provide good structures and generate novel solutions for artificial intelligence. And then artificial intelligence both will help us to analyze the data, but also generate predictions and think about the tools that we need for conceptualizing and understanding the brain. And my lab has a number of research projects in this vein. They can be difficult to describe in short periods, so I have not attempted to do so in this presentation. But what I will say is that the entire philosophy that underpins this is the idea that there are general principles of intelligence that apply equally to natural intelligence and artificial intelligence. And our lab's goal is to try to seek out those principles and use them to guide both neuroscience and artificial intelligence research.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I will give you a very broad overview of the type of research that we do around housing issues in the Canada Research Chair on Housing, Community and Health that I lead. Thank you, Preeti. So as you may know, poor housing conditions or housing conditions are important determinants of health. And we've seen this especially since the beginning of the confinement in relation to the coronavirus. So housing conditions are associated with transmission of the disease. It provides protection or expose us to risk. It also gives us or not the space to cope with the confinement. But in addition to being a risk factor, a protective factor for the COVID, poor housing conditions are associated with a wide range of health conditions and risk factors, and you have some examples here. And why is it important to pay attention to housing in a country like Canada, where there are actually important inequalities in housing conditions? About 13% of households, so about 9 million Canadians, are living in core housing need. So in housing that is unaffordable, that is overcrowded, or that requires major repairs. About 24% of Canadians are living in a dwelling that they cannot afford, and 7% in a dwelling in need of major repairs. And the most important housing needs are experienced by Indigenous peoples in the country. And the highest housing need are observed in Inuit regions in northern Canada, such as in Nunavut, where 37% of the population is in core housing need, and 56% are living in overcrowded conditions. So not only are there social inequalities in the distribution of housing conditions, but there are also important spatial inequalities. So inequalities across space. So you have, for example, on the island of Montreal, areas where very few people are living in overcrowded conditions. And you also have areas in yellow, orange, and reds where more than 20% or 40% or 50% actually of people living in these areas are living in unaffordable housing conditions. So we have spatial inequalities in housing condition within urban settings and between urban and rural settings as well. Here you have a map of the distribution of energy poverty in some areas of Canada. So energy poverty refers to unaffordable energy prices that prevents people from having adequate warmth, or on a day like today, adequate cool. So to be comfortable in terms of temperature within their dwelling. So important inequalities across the country in housing unaffordability and energy poverty. And all these housing conditions have potentially quite important impact on people's health. So before going into some of the questions that we're working on in the research chair, I just wanted to share with you some of the approach that we are using to conduct research. One thing that we're doing is that we're working within an integrated knowledge translation framework. And what I mean by that is that we are working with knowledge users. So with Indigenous organizations, with housing organizations, with public health directions, to come up with research questions that the organization need to see address in order to improve service delivery, to inform their decision making, or also to inform policy. So we're working with knowledge users at all steps of the research project, from framing the research question to writing the proposal to implementing the study, interpreting and disseminating results. So the research that we do in the Canada Research Share is really applied. One thing that we're doing more and more is that we're working within a population health intervention research framework. And what I mean by that is that we're looking at changes in the housing environment or in the community environment. So for example, we're assessing the impact of the construction of social housing on people's health. So if thing changes, what will be the impact on health? And you'll see examples of many research questions that we're working on. We're using a variety of methods. So in my group, we're using methods stemming from analysis of large population health survey linked to geographical information on neighborhood conditions. We're conducting in-depth interviews. We're using photo voice to understand meanings of health and meaning of houses, for example. So a variety of methods to answer a variety of research questions. So here you have examples of some of the questions we're asking in the Pan-Canadian partnership at home in the North. So it's a partnership that involves academics, but also organizations and communities, Indigenous communities from the provincial North, from the territories, and also from Inuit Nunangat, so the 4 Inuit regions in Northern Canada. And we're working together to promote housing, Northern housing security, to understand how communities can implement, how they can implement culturally relevant housing plans and design, and how these might impact health at a population level. In collaboration with Montreal Public Health, we're working on neighborhood design and housing conditions. So we're asking questions like, who can afford to live in healthy neighborhoods? So if you think of a healthy or sustainable neighborhood, you think about ease of walking or cycling around, to take public transit, to have access to healthy food options. You're looking at neighborhoods with different things to do and places to go. And if you have these, super nice and healthy neighborhoods and sustainable neighborhoods, it's going to drive land prices and housing prices. And by building neighborhoods that are sustainable and healthier, we might actually contribute to increasing inequalities by increasing housing prices. So we're looking at these types of questions, working in collaboration with Montreal Public Health. It's on pause right now because of the coronavirus, but I have an undergrad student working on this project and doing mapping of all housing conditions and neighborhood conditions across Montreal. And one set of questions that we are working more in my lab is around the idea of energy poverty that I briefly mentioned. So energy poverty in Europe, in New Zealand, is right at the top of the public health agenda in terms of policy, but also in terms of research. And it's something that has been pretty much overlooked in Canada. So depending on the indicators that we're using, anywhere between 6 to 25% of the Canadian population might be in energy poverty. And this might be associated with the increase or the excess mortality and hospitalization that we see during winter in relation to respiratory and cardiovascular diseases. So we're working with a small community in Nova Scotia, Bridgewater. Bridgewater has won the Smart City Challenges to implement an energy poverty reduction program. And all these questions emerged through discussion with Bridgewater. So they are implementing an energy poverty reduction program. We submitted together a grant proposal to the Canadian Institute of Health Research to assess the impact of the program on health for people who benefit from the program, but also for the community as a whole. So time will tell whether we get that grant or not. But energy poverty is something that we will be working more and more in the research share over the coming years. So if you want to know more about housing and health and about neighborhoods and health, these are the courses that I teach in geography. And there's also the minor in health geography if you want to join us. Thank you.